Hello, everybody. Before I start teaching about the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which is the subject of today's class, let me remind you that you have a lab worksheet to do this week, and it's due on Friday, and you have a problem set that is due on Sunday. If you have difficulties with these, technical or otherwise, please contact me so that we can discuss accommodation and an extension. If you have questions about the content there, also, about the questions on the problem set, please also contact me and I'll clarify it. The problem set is, like all other problem sets, open book, and the lab worksheet is what I'm hoping is that you will use the online version of Anatomy and Physiology Revealed to complete the worksheet. Okay, so today we are going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. These are two of the most important components of the endocrine system. We'll talk about some of the anatomy of the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, including something called the portal microcirculation. We'll talk about the hormones that the hypothalamus releases, and in doing so, controls the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. That's where we're going to spend most of our time today. We'll also spend a little bit of time talking about the hormones released by the posterior pituitary gland. And then at the end, we will talk about a specific feed forward and feedback system, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, HPA axis, that causes the release of adrenal cortisol, which is an important part of the stress response. All right, so here is a midline sagittal section of a human head. Some of these structures you should be able to identify already. Here's the corpus callosum. Here is the calcarine sulcus of the occipital lobe. What else could we see here? Here's the fornix. Here's the cerebellum. We could do a lot of this, right? But the point is, here is the thalamus. This white thing right here is the optic chiasm, cut in half. This is the hypothalamus. Let me color that red. This is the hypothalamus. This is the area that we're most interested in today, right here, the hypothalamus. And this, in green, is the pituitary gland, right here. Here is a cartoon of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So here's the hypothalamus up here, and here is the pituitary gland down here. The hypothalamus is in the brain. The pituitary is in a little pocket in the skull. So there's a connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. This whole thing is the pituitary. The connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary is this narrow structure here called the infundibulum, and it has a specialization within it called the median eminence. So the hypothalamus is part of the brain. It has neurons, it has endocrine cells, and it has neuroendocrine cells. So these green objects here are representing the neuroendocrine cells. They're neurons that have axons that project to the posterior pituitary, where they release hormones into a circulation, into the blood. So these neurons, these neuroendocrine cells, action potentials in the axon, release of neurohormones into the circulation of the posterior pituitary. And the two most important hormones released by the hypothalamic neuroendocrine cells in the posterior pituitary are vasopressin and oxytocin. We're not going to talk too much about vasopressin because that's important for kidney function, and we talk about that in AMP2. We will talk about oxytocin because that's important for female reproductive endocrinology, among other things. In addition to these green neuroendocrine cells, there are endocrine cells in the hypothalamus that release their neurohormone at the median eminence. And there is a circulation called the portal circulation that carries blood from the median eminence to the anterior pituitary. So the connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary is neuronal, but the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is via a blood flow. The portal circulation carries blood from the median eminence to the anterior pituitary and carries the hypothalamic hormones from the median eminence to the anterior pituitary. The hormones, the hypothalamic hormones that are released at the median eminence are these, and we'll unpack those as we go along. These hormones, GHRH, CRH, somatostatin, TRH, GnRH, and dopamine, these are the hypothalamic hormones that are released at the median eminence and carried by the portal circulation to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary cells express receptors for the hormones, for GHRH. So for example, there are cells in the anterior pituitary called somatotrophs that express receptors for GHRH, and they in turn release growth hormone. There are other cells in the anterior pituitary that express the receptor for CRH, and they in turn release ACTH when stimulated by CRH, and those cells are called the corticotrophs. There are cells in the anterior pituitary that express receptors for TRH, and those cells, when stimulated by TRH, release TSH, and the T there stands for thyroid. So TRH is thyroid releasing hormone, and it triggers the release of TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid. So the bottom line is that hypothalamic hormones released in the median eminence travel to the anterior pituitary, interact with specific receptors on specific cells in the anterior pituitary to cause the release of other hormones. We're going to unpack that in detail over the course of the next hour or so. So here is the feedback loop that we talked about on Tuesday. The hypothalamus releases hormones like, let's just say, TRH. TRH travels down by the portal circulation to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary, release TSH, which travels by the body circulation to the thyroid in this case, and the thyroid is going to release thyroid hormones. That's the feed-forward signaling. The feedback signaling is that TSH can feed back onto the hypothalamus to inhibit TRH release, and thyroid hormones can feed back onto either the pituitary or onto the hypothalamus to inhibit either the release of TSH or TSH here, or they can inhibit the release of TRH here. And this negative feedback is important for the homeostatic control of the level of thyroid hormone, which is important for health. We live in an environment where we want a certain amount of thyroid hormone, not too much and not too little. Here is a cartoon that illustrates what I just talked to you about. The hypothalamus releases TRH. There's the unpacking of the language. TRH is thyrotropin releasing hormone. I think I said thyroid releasing hormone previously, and that was wrong. It's TRH is thyrotropin releasing hormone. That travels through the median eminence to the anterior pituitary, and the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary express the receptor for TRH, and when stimulated by TRH, they release TSH. TSH is released by the anterior pituitary into the systemic circulation, where it goes to the thyroid gland and everywhere else. The cells of the thyroid gland express receptors for TSH, and when stimulated, they release thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, the iodinated derivatives of tyrosine. Those go into the systemic circulation also. T3 and T4 go into the systemic circulation, and a wide variety of peripheral tissues, brain, bone, muscle, the GI tract, all express receptors for thyroid hormones, and it's important for their metabolic control. Here is the feedback. T3 and T4 both do negative feedback, and TSH. Well, I guess we know that T3 and T4 do negative feedback. So those are the important negative feedbacks in this particular system. So now let's unpack the language of these hormones. It looks like alphabet soup, but you need to know what these letters are all standing for. So the hypothalamus, let's just start here and we'll go through it one at a time. The hypothalamus, the endocrine cells of the hypothalamus, really the neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus, release their hormones at the median eminence. One of the hormones is GHRH, which stands for growth hormone releasing hormone. GH is growth hormone. So GHRH is growth hormone releasing hormone. When it interacts with GHRH receptors that are expressed on the somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary, and when these somatotrophs, these specific cells of the anterior pituitary, are activated by GHRH binding, they release growth hormone into the systemic circulation, which has a lot of effects. We'll talk about those later. Other neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus release CRH, which stands for corticotropin releasing hormone. Travels through the portal circulation to the anterior pituitary. It interacts with the CRH receptors that are expressed on corticotrophs. And when those cells are activated by the activation of their CRH receptors, they release ACTH, which stands for adrenocorticotrophic hormone. Here's the story we had on the earlier slide. Other neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus release thyrotropin-releasing hormone, travels through the portal circulation to the anterior pituitary, interacts with TRH receptors on thyrotrophs, which, when activated, trigger the thyrotrophs to release TSH. Other cells of the anterior of the hypothalamus release GnRH, which stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. When GnRH activates the GnRH receptors of gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary, it stimulates the release of two other hormones. One is called follicle-stimulating hormone, and the other is called luteinizing hormone. And these are going to be very important for male and female reproductive endocrinology. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, but it is also a hormone. When released by cells of the hypothalamus into the portal circulation, it interacts with the lactotrophs, with dopamine receptors on lactotrophs of the posterior pituitary, and it inhibits the release of a hormone called prolactin, which is going to be an important part of control of lactation after childbirth. And finally, there are cells that release somatostatin, cells of the hypothalamus that release somatostatin, and somatostatin causes changes in the release of a number of hormones, including it inhibits the somatotrophs. It inhibits the somatotrophs from releasing growth hormone. So somatostatin is sort of a negative hormone. It also has effects on TSH, insulin, and glucagon. So I recommend that you review this slide, either with or without my narration, and unpack all of these letters, and so that you know what GHRH is and what GnRH is and what cells release growth hormone, the somatotrophs, what cells release ACTH, the corticotrophs, what cells release TSH, the thyrotrophs, what cells release FSH and LH, the gonadotrophs. It takes some doing to memorize and learn all of these connections. Now let's talk about the functions of those anterior pituitary hormones. So the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary release ACTH, which stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. The hormone goes from the anterior pituitary into the systemic circulation, so the hormone goes everywhere in the body, but the adrenal cortex is the target. Those are the cells that express the ACTH receptor. And when activated by ACTH, the cells of the adrenal cortex increase the synthesis and secretion of steroid hormones from the adrenal cortex. This is going to include cortisol. When the cells of the anterior pituitary, the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary, release TSH, the hormone goes everywhere, but its target is the thyroid gland in the neck, and the thyroid gland expresses TSH receptors. When activated, the cells of the thyroid release thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. The somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary release growth hormone. Growth hormone has effects on many cells, and it has many effects, including transcription, translation, and division. The gonadotrophs release FSH, and LH. So the gonadotrophs release FSH and LH. The hormones go everywhere, like all the other hormones, but the target are the ovaries in females and the testes in men. And this, so in female reproductive endocrinology, FSH is going to cause the maturation of follicles, and LH is going to cause the ovulation of follicles and the development of the corpus luteum as part of the female reproductive cycle. In males, FSH causes an increase in the production of sperm, and luteinizing hormone, LH, causes the release of other hormones like testosterone. So again, I think reviewing this slide and testing yourself, what does, just start with a blank paper and just say, okay, what does TSH do? Okay, well, it targets the thyroid and triggers the release of thyroid hormone. What does GH do? Well, GH is from somatotrophs and it has many effects. I think being able to reproduce this table from memory will convince you that you know this information. Here is a more graphic illustration of the same material. So this just shows the hypothalamus in a schematic way. This shows the anterior pituitary, and this shows the target cells of the pituitary hormones, of the cells of the hormones from the anterior pituitary. So it's the same information. TRH stimulates the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary, which stimulates the thyroid. CRH from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of ACTH from the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary, and it targets the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol. So that rather than go through all of this again, let me just recommend that you review this slide, which is a little bit more graphic. And keep in mind the hypothalamic hormones, or put into your mind the hypothalamic hormones, the anterior pituitary hormones, and the targets. So we did talk about this effect. We did talk about this effect previously. We will talk about prolactin and its effects on milk development, milk production, and breast development. And we will talk about the secretion of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. We are not going to focus too much on IGF-1. And this topic about how growth hormone affects many things is kind of too broad to talk about. You should know that growth hormone causes these things: synthesis, carbohydrate metabolism, lipid metabolism, but we're not going to go into details about how it does that. The hormones of the posterior pituitary that we're going to mention but not talk about a lot are vasopressin, and like I said, its target is the kidney, and we talk about that in the kidney section of AMP2. We will talk about oxytocin and how its effects are on the uterus to cause contraction during childbirth, its effects on the mammary gland to cause ejection of milk after childbirth, and its effect on the brain, which has important effects on mating and other behaviors. Okay, let's do a clicker. So, which of the following are hormones that are released at the median eminence? And then, why don't we just do both of these clickers? I'm going to pause it now. You should stop and try to answer the question, and then resume after you have answered the question. So which of the following are hormones that are released at the median eminence? And which of the following is true of the anterior pituitary? Pause now, answer the question, and then continue. Okay, which of the following are hormones that are released at the median eminence? That is to say, which of these are hypothalamic hormones? And the answer is dopamine and GHRH are hypothalamic hormones that are released at the median eminence. FSH is a pituitary hormone that is released by the gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary, and TSH is a pituitary hormone that is released by the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary. Those are not released at the median eminence. Those are released at the anterior pituitary. Which of the following is true of the anterior pituitary? Let's look at the correct answers. A subpopulation of cells in it releases TSH. That's a correct statement. It's referring to the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary. It receives blood flow from the hypothalamo-pituitary portal arterial system. Yes, that's just a true anatomical statement. Hypothalamo-pituitary is an official name for this portal circulation. I won't ask you to memorize that name. I will assume that, but I do want you to know the name portal circulation. Let's see, anterior pituitary. It is not the location of nerve terminals of the from the hypothalamus. This A is describing the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is the location of neuroendocrine terminals for some hypothalamic neurons, but the anterior pituitary is not. Each endocrine cell in it releases a mixture of hormones is a dead wrong statement. Each endocrine cell in it releases a specific hormone. The population of cells releases a mixture of hormones, but each cell releases a specific hormone and has the receptors for a specific stimulating or releasing hormone. Okay, here's another clicker. I recommend that you stop the slideshow, pause what we're doing, and answer the questions, and then resume. So for gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary, which of the following are true? They are all true. The gonadotrophs release LH and FSH. They respond to GnRH. These hormones are important for sexual development, ovaries and testes, and they're important for germ cell development. They're important for the development of ova in the female and sperm in the male. For lactotrophs of the anterior pituitary, which of the following are true? Let's go through them one at a time. The lactotrophs of the anterior pituitary do not release GnRH and dopamine. They respond to dopamine, but they release prolactin. So this is a false statement. They respond to GnRH and dopamine. Well, they do respond to dopamine. That's a true statement, but they do not respond to GnRH. So that's a false statement, so that's wrong. They are important for germ cell development. No, the lactotrophs are important for production of milk, but they're not important for germ cell development. But because the prolactin released by lactotrophs is important for the release of milk during lactation, they are more important in females. That's a true statement. So let's walk through one of the axes, the HPA axis. Well, so what we're going to do now, speaking broadly, is we're going to talk about the stress response, and then we will talk about the metabolic responses to other hormones, insulin and glucagon, and we'll talk about responses for growth and metabolism, and there we're going to talk about thyroid and growth hormones. We will not talk about water and electrolyte too much because these are covered in AMP2, but we will cover the reproductive endocrinology that is important, that is a product of LH and FSH and the steroid hormones, testosterone, the estrogens, and progesterone. So let's talk about stress. You're probably experiencing quite a lot of stress these days. Let's see if talking about it from a physiological perspective is interesting and helpful. So we have many forms of stress. Some forms of stress are physiological and are beneficial. And some forms of stress are pathological and not beneficial. We evolved in a system where we experienced short-term stresses like, oh, that bear is charging towards me. I had better flee because otherwise I am not going to survive this very acute stressor. That's the kind of acute stress that we evolved to deal with. We did not evolve to deal with the chronic stress of going to college, living in a COVID-19 infected world. Those kinds of chronic stressors lead to pathological responses. But this is a physiology course, and so we're going to focus mostly on the physiological effects of stress, the beneficial effects of stress. So just getting up in the morning, just waking up in the morning and getting out of bed is a stressor. Getting, seeing a car go through the red light and coming at you in the crosswalk and you better run out of the way is a stressor. Those are short-term stresses. We respond to stresses. Our brain detects stresses and it tells the hypothalamus, okay, I got a stress going on. The hypothalamus then responds to that neuronal input and releases CRH into the portal circulation at the median eminence, which interacts with CRH receptors of the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary, which release ACTH into the systemic circulation. That goes everywhere, but the target of ACTH are the cells of the adrenal cortex. The cells of the adrenal cortex express ACTH receptors, and when activated by ACTH, those cells release cortisol. Cortisol has many effects, pleiotropic effects. It controls the blood flow through controlling blood pressure and control of specific vascular circulation. It stimulates the production of glucose by gluconeogenesis or by glycogenolysis in the liver. It releases glucose into the bloodstream to help us survive those stressful responses. That glucose in the bloodstream goes to the brain and helps the brain deal with the stress. In addition, cortisol inhibits growth and reproduction, and it inhibits the immune response. You may have heard of steroid hormones like, I'm blanking on the word. There are steroid hormones that are used as immune suppressants, steroid hormone drugs that are used as immune suppressants. And cortisol is a natural, that is to say, an endogenous immune suppressant. So these are just some of the effects of cortisol. Cortisol is necessary for survival. If you don't have cortisol, because of its control of metabolism here and blood pressure here, no cortisol is not a survivable defect. So cortisol is required for survival. This is a cartoon of the adrenal gland with its medulla in the middle, the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex is on the outside of the adrenal gland, just like the cerebral cortex is on the outside of the brain. The cells of the adrenal cortex release the steroid hormones, aldosterone, cortisol, androgens like androstenedione and DHEA. These steroid hormones are released by the adrenal cortex. I will not ask you to memorize the names of the zones that release the hormones. So you don't have to memorize zona glomerulosa. You don't have to memorize zona fasciculata. You don't have to memorize zona reticularis. Don't worry about those. But I do want you to know that the adrenal cortex is the source of adrenal hormones, aldosterone, and especially now in the setting of stress, cortisol. The adrenal medulla is also important for the release of a stress-related hormone, epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are also critical for the stress response, especially in the control of heart rate, heart contraction, and blood pressure, which is essential for responding to stress. So here is a flow chart for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis for the response to stress. So you detect a stress. Your brain detects a stress. Your brain detects a stress. The sympathetic nervous system of your brain, releases norepinephrine and epinephrine. And that does many things, including control of the heart, which we talk about in AMP2. It controls breathing, which we talk about in AMP2. And in the pancreas, norepinephrine and epinephrine control the release of hormones that we will talk about in this course, glucagon and insulin release, that are important for control of glucose in the blood. It also has an effect on fat metabolism, which we will not talk about. So stress activates the sympathetic nervous system, and it also activates the corticotrophs of the hypothalamus to release CRH. CRH, the thing that you need to know about CRH, remember it's released into the median eminence of the infundibulum. That blood flows to the anterior pituitary. It flows everywhere, but the cells that express CRH receptors are the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary. They respond to CRH activation of CRH receptors by releasing ACTH. ACTH goes into the systemic circulation, where it interacts with the cells of the adrenal cortex and stimulates those to release cortisol. Cortisol has many effects. It can affect the sympathetic nervous system. It can affect the pancreas, and it can affect immune system, the production of inflammatory cytokines, and the production of other hormones like prostaglandins. So the stress response that you're probably aware of, your heart beating fast and beating strongly, that is caused by the sympathetic nervous system. The stress response that you might not be aware of, we've just covered with the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. Cortisol, though, is an essential response to stress. So this slide is actually some data that shows the release of cortisol as a function of time of day. So here's your, at rest, when you're sleeping, cortisol levels are low. Just before you wake up, cortisol levels increase because there is a small spike in ACTH. The hypothalamus also has clock cells that know the time of day or time of night. Those cells tell the certain neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus, okay, time to release CRH. CRH tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. So there is an endogenous clock mechanism that causes the release of ACTH and the release of cortisol, which spikes, which peaks right after waking up. Then there are some spikes of cortisol during the day. There is fluctuations in the levels of ACTH and cortisol during the day. But the point is there are surges of cortisol during the day, and that is an important physiological response to just living on planet Earth, dealing with stressors sometimes, or just being awake. There will be clock-driven releases of cortisol during the day. So some of these could be response to stress, and some of these could be response to just being awake. So that is the last slide for today. I'll pick up next week with more endocrine physiology. Remember, please, the worksheet, the lab worksheet, and the problem set due on Friday and on Sunday, respectively. And please contact me if you have any questions.